Shabbat Shalom, everybody. It's wonderful to be back here in person, here in the sanctuary this morning, with all of you physically present and with everybody joining us from home as well. I don't know if you saw in the news this past week, but Pope Francis returned from a 4-day tour to Iraq. And when I heard that he was going to Iraq, I did a double take. In general, I know that popes go all over the places. They do papal visits all over. But Iraq is not a place I ever pictured the Pope going to. So I did a little bit more research, and it turns out it really was a historic trip. In 1964, Pope Paul VI visited Jerusalem, and that was actually the first time a pope had left Italy in almost 2 centuries. And since that trip, popes have visited, since 1964, more than half the countries in the world. And yet, this was the first time in centuries that a pope had gone to Iraq. And I was intrigued. I admit that when I think of Iraq, Catholicism isn't the first thought that comes to my mind, nor is religious tolerance. In truth, these are low on the list of things that I associate with the story of Iraq. And yet, as I dove deeper, I was surprised to learn that for centuries there was a strong Catholic community living in what is today modern-day Iraq. And for much of that time there was peace and tolerance with their neighbors. And I share all of this with you because it got me thinking about the topic I want to address today. A topic that I think is best summed up in the words of Orson Welles. If you want a happy ending, that depends, of course, on where you stop the story. And the lesson is obvious, and yet I think it's one that we also tend to forget too easily. We take for granted that how things are now are how things always were. And we imagine that how things are now at the moment is also how they are most likely to remain. Yet as Wells reminds us, stories continue to unfold. They continue to develop. There is no true ending, and their character depends on simply which part of the story one chooses to tell. So today, when the Pope takes a trip to the Middle East, it represents religious tolerance and dialogue. It's a mission of peace and unity. Yet for centuries, that wasn't the story of when a Pope visited the Middle East or sent others in his place. It was just the opposite. And it's because of this trip to Iraq that seems so out of sync with my own story of the country that it stayed in my mind. And while I don't imagine Iraq as a place of religious pluralism, and certainly not as a place for Jews, it's true that that's not the full story. 2,500 years ago, it was the center of Jewish life. After the destruction of the temple, the largest Jewish community was in what we now know as Iraq. And then it was Babylonia. And over the centuries, Jews living there thrived. It's after all where the Talmud was completed. It's after all where some of the most influential rabbinic voices arose and taught. For 5 centuries, it was the center of Jewish life and learning. And that would have been a good ending to the story, but it went on. There was violence, there was persecution, and by the end of the millennium, the standing of Jewish academies declined. It was no longer a center of Jewish thought that it had been. But by the 12th century, there were more than 40,000 Jews living there. Numerous synagogues and yeshivot. Jews in Iraq were able to participate in commerce as merchants, artisans, even practice medicine. It was again a place of tolerance, a place of opportunity for Jewish residents, culminating in the 13th century when Sa'ad al-Dawla, a Jewish physician, was made the Grand Vizier under one of the rulers. Things looked good again until they didn't. They were good again during the Ottoman rule. From the 1500s to the early 1900s, Jewish life in Iraq prospered. There was religious liberty to practice their beliefs and educate their children, and one Ottoman sultan even appointed thousands of Jews to various governmental positions. Things were good until a century ago. And since then, Iraq has not been a place of safety or prosperity for Jews. Today, one can count the number of Jews living there on one hand. You see the pattern, though. Things change. The story that is in my mind of the country is not the full story. A story is one of triumph or tragedy, depending on which segment one chooses to tell. And it's important to remember that how things are today is not how they always were or how they always have to be. If we could go back and meet a fellow Jew living in the country, depending on which century they lived in, they would tell us either a story of affliction or of prosperity. And I bring this all up because this upcoming week will be a year now since our synagogue first closed its doors due to COVID-19. It was March 16th, 2020, that we held our last in-person service before the first lockdown. And since then, we've had various periods during which we've opened to different degrees. But for a year now, the majority of our community has been meeting online. The majority of our celebrations, our prayers, our holidays, classes, programs, and other communal activities have taken place virtually. And I'm incredibly proud of how we as a community have come together this year. But I know that it's not the same. I know that still, despite all we are doing, we have many members who are unable to connect virtually. I know that we have many who, despite these opportunities for connection, still feel incredibly alone. This year has been difficult. We have members who have faced illness and loss without the same support they would have otherwise received in different years. We have members who have faced financial problems as well as a result of this pandemic. Now, these problems are not unique. They're what almost everybody in the world has been experiencing this past year. Everybody has suffered to various degrees. And while the end is in sight, there is still a long way to go before a return to normalcy. It will take time before everyone is vaccinated, not just here in Canada, but around the world. And even then, the economic impact will continue. Some people lost everything that they spent a lifetime building. Shelters, food banks, organizations that provide clothing and essential services are seeing record numbers of people in need. And I say all of this not to depress you, but I recognize that it is depressing. Just a year ago, few, if any of us, would have imagined that things would get as bad as they did or would last as long as they have. And if we tell the story of just this past year, it is by any measure a tragedy. Sure, there have been highlights, moments of respite from the constant stream of bad news, personal celebrations, even those celebrated differently, still brought joy. There have been stories of people coming together, doing incredible acts of kindness and charity. But by any measure, the past 12 months have been bad. But the story doesn't end here. The next chapter is yet to be written. In this Shabbat, we finish the book of Shemot. And if this was where the story ended, we'd be a nation wandering in the desert. And even when we complete the annual cycle of Torah readings, if that was where the story of our people ended, we would never have entered the promised land. Our Parsha this week describes the building of the tabernacle. But we know that the story goes on. Eventually, rather than praying or sacrificing in a tent, Shlomo built a beautiful temple in Jerusalem. And we know that the story doesn't end there because it's destroyed, it's rebuilt, and it's destroyed again. And then a new chapter is written. 2,000 years in the diaspora, the Judaism we know and practice is authored. In 2 weeks, we will sit at our Seder tables. We will recount the story of redemption from Egypt, our redemption from slavery. And while there's no archaeological evidence of that story, I've always found it ironic that the oldest piece of archaeological evidence of the Israelite people is actually an Egyptian artifact. The Merneptah stele, written more than 3,000 years ago, it records the military victories of the Egyptian ruler Merneptah. And it states in it that Israel is laid waste and his seed is not. Now there's debate among scholars as to exactly what that means, or to what event it refers to. And yet we all know something. We know that whatever victory it celebrates, that wasn't how the story ended. 3,000 years later, we are still here. This Shabbat, let us remember that how things are is not how they always will be. The next chapter of the story remains to be written, and we are the ones who can shape what it says. Many different rabbis and scholars note linguistic similarities between the building of the tabernacle and the story of creation. And the drash they offer us is that we, human beings, are partners in creation. We are the ones who can shape our destiny. Will we let this year represent a new standard for synagogue life? Will attendance at services and programs be just a fraction of what they once were? Or will we come back in force when it is safe to do so? Because we value even more now the ability to see each other face to face. Will we let this year set the tone for how we support each other in times of loss and hardship? Or will we go now to even greater lengths when we can, because we see how important it is to stand with others, to let them know they are not alone in their grief or their struggle? Will the exponential growth this year of those in need become a new normal? Or will we give even more, not just time and resources, but ourselves, to ensure that no person in our community or in our city is forced to go without? The story of how COVID-19 has impacted our synagogue, our community, our city, our world is not yet finished. It will be up to us to determine if it's one of sadness and pain or one of hope and resilience. On Rosh Hashanah we pray, Kodveinu b'Sefer HaChaim, that God will write us in the book of life. Today I pray that with our deeds, Nichtov Sefer Chaim, we will write a new ending. We will write a story of life, a story of unity, of resilience in the face of adversity, of kindness and compassion, a story of coming together. Shabbat Shalom.